Yeah, man, I'll tell you what, that dang old internet, man, you just go on there and point and click it, and then talk about www. Call me, you got then.
For some reason or another, you sound a little taller on radio.
Well, for my money, he's got all the facial characteristics of a criminal.
Now, here's your host, that gravy-sopping, crappie-flopping, stump-jumping, Bible-thumping, gun-toting, mater-growing son of a gun, the Backwoods Baptist himself, Pastor Harold Smith.
Let me shut those window blinds. I got deer running through the yard. I don't want to get distracted because I got a great topic today. I'm going to talk about Reformed Baptist. And explicitly why people would think I'm a Reformed Baptist or be shocked that I'm not a Reformed Baptist, and really kind of what I see in the group and some of the problems that we have. And people say, well, what kind of Baptist are you, Harold? And I'm like, I'm a Backwoods Baptist. I'm the kind of Baptist that you would have saw in the backwoods of America throughout the mid 1700s to, I would say, up until the probably middle of the 20th century. It was a common Baptist preacher that was relatively unknown. Nobody knew who we were. We just pastored churches. I happen to have a podcast that gives me a little bit of voice out to the world. And so I kind of always in this podcast have wanted to be a voice. I wanted to give a perspective that wasn't being covered on the more popular, prominent podcast. And you know, really, the size of the podcast that I host is not, I mean, I'm not having some great impact, but evidently there are people out there who do listen to the podcast. Some of them have rated the podcast and shared it on social media. I never asked people to do that. If you like it, you like it. If you want to share it, you'll share it. I don't have to tell you, smash that like button, go leave us a post, go do. No. If you like this, fine. If you don't like it, criticize it. I give my email at the end of these. I invite you to send me your questions, your comments. And so anyways, the reason why I say I'm a Backwoods Baptist is because I think really that's most of what the flyover parts of America today are made up of, what I would call Backwoods Baptists. We're just typical, ordinary people. I always say we look at today's issues with an open Bible and a heaping helping of country fried common sense. Yeah, we're just looking at things logically and biblically. And sometimes I think people look at things biblically and they don't have logic on it. And Reformed Baptists really get bent out of shape. Well, if it's biblical, that's all that matters. And yeah, but you know, one of those great Reformed preachers named Martin Lloyd-Jones defined preaching as logic on fire. And the fire was the Spirit and the Word of God that ignites our logic and makes it preaching. And so I'm not saying that we apply logic or human reasoning over the Bible. I'm just saying a lot of the problems that we're facing today are really common sense. But we live in a country that no longer majors on common sense. And that's part of our problem. And you too, you might be a Backwoods Baptist. You didn't even know it. But if you were at church Sunday and people were talking about how much rain they had in their rain gauge, there's a good chance you're probably a Backwoods Baptist. So what are we talking about today? Reformed Baptist. And we're talking about Reformed Baptists, and I'm going to speak in generalities. The reason I'm going to speak in generalities is because I'm talking about Reformed Baptist in general. Yes, I could pick 5 Reformed Baptist pastors and 5 Reformed Baptist churches and go down a list, but then everyone would be, well, he's not talking about me. So the argument then, if you talk in generalities, is, well, I don't believe that. I didn't say that. My friend wouldn't do that. Our church doesn't believe that way. I know. When you talk about Baptist, period, we believe in the individual autonomy of each local church. That's why we're Baptist. So there's a broad spectrum of Southern Baptists. There's a broad spectrum of Independent Baptists. And yes, there's a very broad spectrum of Reformed Baptists. So I'm going to be talking today in generalities. If you can handle generalities, I'm sure somewhere on the screen or the phone in front of you is a mute off skip, Marcus played button. Go ahead and hit that. But the only way we can discuss the issues facing Reformed Baptists today is to talk in some generalities. The reason I'm talking in generalities is because I happen to have a lot of Reformed Baptist friends. Some of my closest friends, men I talk to on a regular, almost weekly basis, would call themselves Reformed Baptist. And so when I say I've got friends in this, I'm not anti-Reformed Baptist. Okay, I'm not. I've actually taken money out of my own pocket and mailed it to Reformed Baptist seminaries and encouraged our entire church to send offering money, mission money, to help a Reformed Baptist seminary get off the ground. I believe in that. I buy books from Reformed Baptist publishers. I preach in Reformed Baptist churches. But I have to talk in generalities because I'm talking about a group, and I'm talking more explicitly about people within that group who make up a large segment of what we see today. So how you can't even accurately and decisively define what a Reformed Baptist is. The reason being is because they vary. Reformed Baptists tend to be covenantal. I would say that's probably across the board, but you're going to find some people that are considered Reformed Baptists that are dispensational and not covenantal. And then you'll find 97 flavors of what it means to be covenantal. Most Reformed Baptists tend to be amillennial or postmillennial. That's the majority of Reformed Baptists, but you do have a few that are premillennial. You have some that are historic premillennial. Most Reformed Baptists would be considered confessional. So they would have some kind of a confession that they adhere to in order to be a member of their church or something like that. You have to adhere to a confession, and the confession, and I'm not a Reformed Baptist, so, they're going to speak more intelligently and they're going to find fault with me here, but Reformed Baptists tend to be operating according to the 9 marks of a healthy church put out by Mark Devers. They usually have a plurality of elders. They're usually elder-led or elder rule. They're not all, but most of them are not congregational in their ecclesiology. And so when we talk about that, I'm giving you some general guidelines. I'm describing in this instance most Reformed Baptist churches. They all would believe in the doctrines of grace or God's sovereignty in salvation. And this is where the problems arise. This is where people just assume that I am a Reformed Baptist because they will talk to me and I will say that God is sovereign in salvation. And when I say that God's sovereign in salvation, I mean mankind just do not on their own free will and volition go out according to their own choosing and pick God out of the plethora of gods available to mankind and say, yes, the one true God, the God of Israel, I'll take him, without God using the preaching of the word and the conviction of the Holy Spirit to draw men into himself. That is monogism. I'm using big words. I might get considered to be a Reformed Baptist. God has to act first on man's behalf. And so when a young Reformed Baptist here's somebody else who's a Baptist that believes God's sovereign and has to work first in the life of a believer, he automatically goes, oh, you believe in the doctrines of grace? Oh, you must be a Reformed Baptist. And I say, no, I'm not a Reformed Baptist. And then there's this confusion. Well, what do you mean you're not a Reformed Baptist? These people are so prominent that about 10, 15 years ago, we had a term for them. They were called the Young, Restless, and Reformed, or just simply the acronym YRR. There were people who were going off to seminary, really reading their Bibles through all the way, and maybe studying verses that they wouldn't have encountered. And they were coming to grips with the fact, okay, there's more to salvation than just repeating a prayer. I mean, there's more to it. God has a greater hand in this. And they were coming to understand that, okay, God's working in salvation here. And there is something in the Bible called predestination. There is something in the Bible called election. And it doesn't line up with what I always thought it lined up. And so they discovered the doctrines of grace. Then they sought out material that would teach them more about it. Where they got that material from, most likely, were from Presbyterians or Reformed churches, Reformed authors, and Reformed writers. The problem with getting the information from the Reformers is they have a different ecclesiology. They have a different church. They have a different government. They have a different view of the covenants than Baptists do. They have a different view of baptism than Baptists do. And so when you start reading all these reformers, you end up picking up a lot of their doctrines that wouldn't line up with what we would call, and I hate to use the word traditional, but traditional Baptist views. And so what happens here is you have a whole group of people who come to the doctrines of grace, the understanding that God's sovereign in salvation, and then they fall headlong into Reformed theology, and now they're arguing over how many elders we should have in a church. They're arguing over whether we should use wine or grape juice. They're arguing over all sorts of things that most Baptists have settled long, long ago. My friend Greg Coleman calls Reformed Baptists, they're Presbyterians in sheep's clothing. And I kind of chuckle at that, and I know that might make a few guys mad, but it's kind of funny. The early Reformed Baptists back then didn't have their own seminary. And so they were having to get their degrees from Westminster or some Reformed college and then go out and teach Baptist distinctives. And you see this in a lot of Reformed Baptists even today. Some of the more prominent and prevalent Reformed Baptist preachers were graduates of Presbyterian and Reformed colleges. And so the point I guess I'm trying to make here is it's okay to be a Reformed Baptist. I'm not anti-Reformed Baptist. It's okay to believe in the covenants. It's okay to be all meal. I guess it's okay to be post meal. There, I said it. It kind of hurt me, but I did say it. The point I'm driving at is I'm not anti that. I'm just explaining that's how a lot of men end up in Reformed Baptist circles. That's how they end up picking up a lot of the baggage of the Reformation, because the reformers were trying to reform the Catholic Church. Baptists, on the other hand, have never been interested in reforming the Catholic Church. Baptists are what we call dissenters. They just want to be left alone. They're not trying to fix Catholicism. They just want to have their own group over here. This is why Baptists historically have been persecuted not only by Catholics, but by the reformers. Shocking, I know. Baptists came to the New World, the American colonies, for religious freedom, only to find themselves imprisoned, excommunicated from town, publicly whipped by, hold on to your seats, reformers, Puritans. A lot of Reformed Baptists are big on the Puritans. Well, the Puritans weren't big on Baptists. We were illegal. We were cast into prison by Puritans. We were cast into prison by the Church of England. The people that left the Church of England and tried to reform it, the Church of England was trying to reform Catholicism. And all of these reformers hated Baptists because we weren't interested in reform. This is why we have the state of Rhode Island today. It was started by a man who disagreed with Puritans over baptism. And he ended up getting his own piece of ground. And John Clark helped Roger Williams. He went to England and lobbied, and they got their own charter with true religious freedom. And the problem that you all know, if you know geography, Rhode Island is the smallest state. And everybody that wasn't a Puritan or Church of England was trying to cram into Rhode Island, the smallest colony in the smallest state. So what ended up happening was a fellow named Penn got a big tract of land, and he opened up Penn's Woods. And he said, what we now know as Pennsylvania, anybody can come here regardless of religion. And that was a relief to the people in Rhode Island because it was getting kind of crowded. And that's why we have all of the Quakers and all of the Amish and all of the Mennonites headquartering in Pennsylvania. Even to this day, they went there because of true religious freedom. Reformers just wanted to reform the church, and they carried a lot of that Catholic baggage with them, because they carried infant baptism with them, because they have a wrong understanding of the covenants. Reformed Baptists have taken the Baptist doctrines and found a different interpretation of the covenants, and that's okay. But what I'm trying to explain to you is I'm not a Reformed Baptist. I don't want all the baggage that comes out of Catholicism with my Baptist. So me personally, I'm a Baptist without the Reformation doctrines. Okay. When I say confessional, most Reformed Baptists, not all, but we have to talk in generalities because we're talking about a general group. Most Reformed Baptists would adhere to the 1689 London Confession of Faith. Some would adhere to the 1644. I personally prefer the 1833 New Hampshire Confession. It's much more milder. It's not nearly as dogmatic. It's got a broadness where Baptists can have enough agreement to say, here's where we're at, and we can differ on other doctrines. So I'm not as rigid as Reformed Baptists tend to be in their doctrine. I don't adhere to confessions nearly as much. I'm not into the regulative principle of worship, which most of them adhere to. And that is only the things that are commanded in Scripture to be done in church can be done in church. And so most Reformed Baptists are very liturgical. They have a very structured, ordered order of service. I mean, it includes all these different steps, oftentimes a reading of the catechism, a reading of the confession of faith, a reading from the Old Testament, a reading from the New Testament. These would all be separate parts, different kinds of songs and hymns being sung. It would be very, very structured. That's not me. I don't do it that way. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm not even interested in really what went on in the Reformation. It's not that important to me. I'm not against it. I'm glad it happened. It broke the band of Catholicism, but I don't spend my time reading Martin Luther. I've got a lot of disagreements with Martin Luther. I don't spend my time reading John Calvin. I've got a lot of disagreements with Calvin. I don't spend my time studying so much the Reformation. And this just, people like modern day Reformed Baptists are like, what kind of a weirdo are you? You believe God's sovereign, but you're not Reformed and you don't care about the Reformation. Bingo, you got it. And believe it or not, the majority of Baptists today, and even in centuries past, felt the exact same way. The reason I say that is because that's one of the problems we have with Reformed Baptists today. I'll talk about it more in a minute. But these guys get all ate up with everything being exactly right. And that's part of a lot of, I think really a lot of it's just the personality of people in this movement. Every little thing, every little tick has to be interlocked exactly right. Everything has to be completely explained. There has to be a question and an answer for every little doctrine. And when you have it all that locked down and that buttoned up and that shut up, you can't compartmentalize somebody like me. And that's kind of why I took the name the Backwoods Baptist, because if you went into the backwoods of America in the pioneer days, you would find some generalized Baptist doctrines that were unanimous across Baptist churches, but you wouldn't find the kind of confessional adherence that you see in Reformed Baptist churches today. You wouldn't find that same doctrinal adherence that the Reformed Baptists are advocating. Let me give you two historical figures that will kind of lay out, I guess, the differences in what I would say a Backwoods Baptist and a Reformed Baptist are. John Gannot. John Gannot at one time was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of New York City. He also was a member of the Philadelphia Baptist Confession, which in 1742 took the London Confession of 1689, which most Reformed Baptists are in love with. They took that, they added two more articles to it, one on laying on of hands and one on the singing of hymns, and they made that the Confession of the Philadelphia Baptist Association. John Gannot was a member of that group. That confession was the predominant Baptist confession throughout America. Many of the churches that were in the backwoods would say they adhered to the Philadelphia Confession, but they didn't adhere to it in a confessional way. In other words, in a binding way, or this is, they weren't studying it and catechizing it. It was more of a general summary of what they believed. That's why when the New Hampshire Confession came along, a broader, milder form of a Baptist confession, it just quickly leaps and bounds jumped ahead of the old Philadelphia Confession. John Gannot was one of the big wheels in that, and he was a Reformed Baptist pastor. He was confessional. At about roughly the same time, while he was alive, the middle of his life, was a fellow named Shubal Stearns, who was saved under the revival preaching of George Whitefield, came to Baptist convictions. He ends up traveling because of religious persecution from Reformed churches. He ends up in Sandy Creek, South Carolina, and he pretty much agrees with the doctrines of grace. He doesn't really have a problem with that. He believes in the sovereignty of God, but he's not confessional. He's not all of the rigid rules of the Reformed Baptist of New England. And so Shubal Stearns is more interested in sending out preachers and planting churches. And the reason they call the South the Bible Belt is because of the churches planted by Shubal Stearns. The churches they planted were not strong doctrinally confessing churches, but they did have Baptist principles. There was a broad autonomy in the way they looked in their preaching. I mean, there was all sorts of things. Maybe one church would do something that none of us would agree with, but for the most part, they were planting Baptist churches. John Gannot and Shubal Stearns both have pretty much the same doctrine in mind, differing on a few things. And those few minor differences didn't negate one of them being Christian and the other not. It didn't negate even really their ability to work together. Later in life, John Gannot moves to Kentucky, which at that time was the Backwoods, and he actually dies there in the early 1800s. And he brings a lot of sound teaching and instruction and higher learning with him, which was much needed in the Backwoods. We're not anti-education. It's just we're more interested in finding men that God has gifted to preach and sending them out into the work than we are sending them off to get a 12 years of seminary and college before they go into the ministry. And you'll find that differing between Reformed Baptist and what I would say Backwoods Baptist. So if you study those two men out, you'll find that they differed some, and that's really kind of the difference we see between the type of Baptist that you would classify me as and the type of Baptist you would classify Reformed Baptist as. And you can speak of me generally because that's generally what I believe. Now, so Brother Harold, you're not a Reformed Baptist. No, I'm not anti-Reformed Baptist. I love them. I think they got a lot of things right. I think they're doing a lot of good things. But me personally, I don't have any interest in being a Reformed Baptist because of the baggage. You see, I work with a lot of Baptist churches, all different kinds. I preach in Reformed Baptist churches, Southern Baptist churches, Independent Baptist churches, Missionary Baptist churches. If I walk in there and say I'm a Reformed Baptist, I'm instantly answering John Calvin questions. I'm instantly answering Martin Luther questions. I'm like, I don't know those guys. I don't study those guys. I don't read those guys. I don't know anything about it. Doesn't have any bearing on me. So I don't want the Reformed title. It's too much baggage. It's too much. This is what's wrong with Catholicism. It's too much of the covenantal, amillennial. That doesn't suit. That's not me. If that's you, that's fine. We still be friends. It's just not me. So what's wrong with the Reformed Baptist movement? Really, on paper, nothing. The problem with the modern Reformed Baptist movement is that it's young. It's new. There were not hardly any Reformed Baptists in America 100 years ago. In the 50s, they all got together up in, I think it was in New Jersey. And Al Martin. Al Martin, I think, held, or maybe in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, somewhere in the Reformed Baptists in the 50s, they held a big like national conference. And there was only like 30 or 40 men in the whole country that would say they were Reformed Baptist. And I think technically, if we looked at some of those men today, we would say, well, they wasn't really Reformed Baptist. But since, like, say, the 50s till now, it's exploded in 70 years. You've got a whole bunch of people. They're saying 1 in 5 men that graduate from Southern Baptist seminaries to pastor are Calvinist. So you've got an explosion, and that explosion means the majority of the preachers in the Reformed Baptist movement are not old men. They're young men. And the problem with young men, I know, because I used to be a young man and I'm 48. Some people would still call me a young man. Young men are immature. And if you've got a movement that is full of young preachers, even if they're spiritually alert and they're studying their Bible and they're praying, you still can't take the 25-year-old out of them. They're still young. They still make bad decisions. It's not that old people don't make them. It's just that we've learned from a lot of our early bad decisions. We kind of quit doing them. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so with Reformed Baptists, you've got a lot of young, really educated preachers who are immature socially. And the problem with being immature socially in our age is we have social media. You see, when I was immature socially, nobody but the people on the job site knew how immature I was. But today with social media, if you're socially immature, then you're going to be socially immature before the whole World Wide Web. And these guys are all social media active. So you've got young men who are highly educated but inexperienced, and they're active on social media. And since they're educated, they're prone to argue. And so if you get on, let's say, Twitter, you get on Twitter and you just pick you out about 24 people that have 1689 in their, or Reformed Baptist in their profile, you're going to find a high percentage of people who are young, immature, highly educated in doctrine, who believe what they are preaching and teaching is the only way. They're the only ones that got it right. There's even a phrase for this. It's called cage stage Calvinism. When they discover the doctrines of grace, they want to argue with everybody about it, and they ought to be caged until they grow out of it. So if you get a whole bunch of cage stage Calvinists who have 1689 in their Twitter profile, they're going to be all over Twitter broadcasting why they're right and everybody else is wrong. That's called arguing. And so you've got a whole segment, a large segment, larger than the Assemblies of God, larger than the Methodist, larger than the Southern Baptist, because those groups have been around a long time. They've got older men. The ages are more evenly distributed, where if you look at Reformed Baptists, it's heavy on young preachers and light on old preachers. And many of the old preachers are just idolized by the young preacher because that's the guy they learned under. When there's not a lot of men teaching, you don't have a lot of people to spread your heroes among. You've got a dozen, 3 dozen, 4 dozen. And so when you have this vacuum of mentors, you've got a handful of people that fit the bill, those men, like it or not, fair to them or not, get idolized. And if you will go and just pick you out a dozen people with 1689 or Reformed Baptist in their Twitter profile, you just go and look, you scroll down through there, see who they're quoting, see what clips they're sharing, see what memes they're putting out. It's all the same. It's the same men from the same big groups. And guess who's hosting the biggest conferences now? It's not the Word of Faith people. That thing's tanked and gone over. It's not the Southern Baptists. They're no longer holding the big conferences. The big conferences are being held by the Reformed Baptist and the people that run in that circle. And since that's where the crowds are, that's where the prominent preachers are, what you're running into is social media is filled with young, arrogant preachers who know it all. And they're angsty about it, and they want to tell everybody about it. Knowledge often leads to pride. If you get a degree, you become proud of that degree. You realize everybody else is dumb. They don't know what you know. You know more. The problem is, we're not saying you guys don't understand doctrine. I get it. You've read Herman Bevnick's Systematic Dogmatics or whatever that book is that they're all the time quoting out of. I get it. You've read the Puritans, you know, John Owen and Richard Baxter. Okay, great. But what's lacking in the Reformed Baptist movement is not that there's good men in here. It's not that all the pastors are bad guys. It's not that if you're in a Reformed Baptist church, you're automatically wrong. It's that the movement as a whole has a high concentration of young people who know it all. and they're socially active on social media. So if you get on social media and you're looking for good Christian folks to follow, you're going to run across a lot of these really active, dogmatic, argumentative, young Reformed Baptist preachers and their wives. That's the other thing. There's a lot of stay-at-home moms who homeschool their kids, who live their lives vicariously on social media through the platform of Twitter. You will find the same 1689 housewife, you'll find 1689 sandwich maker, and this is a badge of honor to them. And they love to get on Twitter and discuss theology and bash everybody they don't agree with. It's not exactly like them. That's the problem with the Reformed Baptist movement. It's not the individuals, because there's good men there. I've got good friends that believe this way, and I respect their faith, and I don't think they're heretical. I don't think they're out of orthodoxy. I think they've got great points, and they make great reasons for why they believe what they believe. I think they have the right to structure their church service any way they want to, because I believe in the independent autonomy of local churches. The problem with your group is the young guys that take your name that go out and give you a black eye on social media. And here's what I'm going to tell you. If you back up and look at if the leaders in the Reformed Baptist movement, and they've tried, I know they've tried. This is why we have the term young, restless, and reformed. They were trying to get people to calm down, settle down, take a chill pill. You don't have to convert the world today. Pace yourself. We're in a marathon, not a sprint. But if the leaders of this group do not start demonstrating on social media some real grace and restraint instead of fueling the fires of their followers, you're going to see the Reformed Baptist movement. If you're a student of history, you can't argue with this. You're going to see them follow the independent fundamental Baptist movement, because the independent fundamental Baptist really came about in the 40s. I know they were around before that. I know Feinberg's Fundamentals was written before that, but they started getting traction under John R. Rice. They started getting traction under that fella in Texas that shot somebody in his office. I can't remember his name all of a sudden. They started getting traction under those guys. Then Jack Hyles, their big prominent guy, came along, and here's what happened to the IFB. They became very dogmatic about what they believed. They were the only ones that were right, just like a lot of Reformed Baptists. They had very prominent and charismatic leaders like Jack Hyles, like Curtis Hudson, like John R. Rice. They had all of these big name preachers. They held the biggest church conferences of the day. They boasted the biggest Sunday school classes in America. They were popular, and they filled themselves full of young people who said, look, I'm an independent fundamental Baptist. I'm right, you're wrong. And knowledge bred pride. And that group became so prideful that here we are in 2023, and they're splintered, they're broken. Nobody's joining them. Nobody believes them. Nobody's interested. The IFBs that peaked in the 70s and 80s have crashed in the next 40 to 50 years. Reformed Baptist, you're doing the same thing. You've gained popularity. You've got charismatic leaders. This is the direction you're headed. There's good men in there. There were good men in the IFB back then. It's the second generation that doesn't pick up the torch and carry it the way mom and dad did. That's what we're dealing with in the Reformed Baptist circles. And if the Reformed Baptist leaders don't find some way to get control of the young, restless, and reformed, you're going to be a tinkling cymbal. You're going to be a sounding brass. Everybody knows who you are. Everybody's heard it. They see you all over Twitter. They see you all over Facebook. They see you all over YouTube. They don't take you serious anymore. Now, look, why do I say this? Because I love Reformed Baptist. I do. Hey, listen, I have taken some of my closest Reformed Baptist friends aside and said, if you don't stop, you're going to lose your ministry. If you don't quit doing what you're doing, you're going to ruin your ministry. I've done that personally. I'm going to tell you who. I've done it personally more than 3 or 4 different people. I've pulled them aside and I've said, I love you. I care about what you're doing. I respect your right to believe Reformed Baptist doctrine. But if you don't tone it back on social media, you're going to make a fool out of yourself. Why did I do that? Because I want the group to go forward. The world's better off when we have people that believe God's sovereign preaching the gospel. The world's better off when we have churches that take the Bible seriously, preaching the gospel, planting churches. I'm not against it. I'm just warning you of where you're headed. And not all of you, but a big chunk of you who are on social media are making fools out of yourself. And the older Christians know it. And if the older Christians know it, I can assure you the lost world knows it. They're not falling for it. They see right through it, but you don't. Young men desire to become a mature man, not just in doctrine, but in action. Now, I know I'm going to get crucified for what I'm saying. I know when I share this on social media where they all dwell, I'm going to get written off as an old hick. He's just a backwoods idiot. That guy don't know anything. That's fine. I've been called far worse by far better people than that. Here's the truth. I'm worse than what you call me. I know who I am. I know what Harold Smith's capable of. So take this for what it is. This is a warning, not a this is not a condemnation. This is a critique about the way your movement is being perceived by the outside world and people that actually care about you and have a lot in common with you. So I know that I'm not going to go to the hyper-reformed guy and put out a podcast to my crowd of 200 listeners and the world's going to change. That's not what I'm hoping. What I'm hoping for is maybe 8, 10, a dozen young preachers hear this and go, yeah, I'm kind of headed in that direction. Yeah, I'm kind of that way. Maybe I do need, maybe he's right. Maybe I need to tone it back. That's what I'm hoping for. See, I'm in the backwoods. I'm not used to speaking to big crowds. I'm used to preaching to small crowds. So my podcast is not geared to reach the masses. But if I can reach a dozen and it saves a dozen men from making some of the foolish mistakes that the contemporaries are, I consider it a success. So that's my prayer. If you want to reach out to me, if you want to criticize me, if you want to give me a bad review, if you want to do all that kind of stuff, do it. You know more about the podcasting world than I do. My email, if you want to talk to me directly, I'll be glad to respond to every email I get. Pastor Harold, PastorHarold @att.net. You shoot me an email. I'll be glad to get back to you. I'm on Twitter at Harold Smith, the Backwoods Baptist. You can find me there. You can read posts of mine there. And listen, I love Reformed Baptist. But if you guys don't do something with those in your group that are giving you a bad name, public perception is going to be your biggest fault. And listen, you have the ability to rein in those that you love, or at least warn them. What they do with your corrections up to them. But if you're just sitting back idly by and letting these guys carry the mail and be out there winning the arguments and winning Twitter wars and starting their own little following on social media, then shame on you for where your movement becomes in the next 50 years. Because I'm trying to warn you, because I love you, because I think the world's better off if we have more healthy churches. That's why I did it. Crucify me now. I can take it. I'm a big boy. I'm not fat. I'm thick-skinned. Say what you want. I said what I wanted. See you guys next time.